Good afternoon, brothers and sisters and young people. We've come to have a look at the first half of this year, which I think most of us would put in the category of the most extraordinary year that we've experienced in a long, long time. When have we ever been through an experience like this? Well, there are reasons for that, we believe, and we'll explore some of those here this afternoon. Now, some of you will have seen a document that we put out a couple of weeks ago. I'm not sure that Brother Greg has circulated this, but I'm going to base my talk this afternoon on that document, which covers the first 6 months of this year, basically. If we were to try and embrace every matter that's significant in fulfilling Bible prophecy, then you'd still be here next week talking about that. So we've been selective, and we'll try and deal with the things that are, we believe, important in relation to fulfilling Bible prophecy. Even so, there's still going to be a fair bit to get through. I want to start, though, with Revelation 11, verse 18. I think this sums up where we are in the scheme of things. And the nations were angry. I think there's a bit of anger around. And thy wrath is come, and the time of the dead that they should be judged. We know we're on the verge of the resurrection of the dead. And that thou shouldest give reward unto thy servants, the prophets, and to the saints, and them that fear thy name, small and great, and shouldest destroy them which destroy the earth. Now that word destroy there is the Greek word diphthero, and it means to rot thoroughly. And I think you'll agree that the world has done that both physically and morally. The world, in terms of its environment, has been totally corrupted by man's industrialisation and every other aspect of his life. And of course we know that God's principles have been abandoned on a wide scale throughout the earth, so that they have corrupted his ways absolutely. Well, the day of judgment is at hand. It's not that far away. Now the year in Australia began, of course, with those disastrous bushfires. You'll all remember them. The fire season actually began last September 2019. And as of the 9th of March, the fires had burned an estimated 8.6 million hectares, and if not in that, the realm of that language, then it was 46 million acres, or 186,000 square kilometres, 72,000 square miles for those of my generation. The fires destroyed over 5,900 buildings, including 2,779 homes, and killed at least 34 people. An estimated, and this is tragic, isn't it, 1 billion animals were killed, and some endangered species were brought closer to extinction on the east coast of Australia. At its peak, air quality in eastern coast cities and towns dropped to hazardous levels, 20 times the dangerous level in places like Sydney. And that's why a lot of other people died as a result of respiratory disease that came from that smoke. It was a perfect storm, wasn't it? Well, extended drought, you're still in a bit of drought up this way. Extended drought, very, very dry grass, undergrowth, etc. Extreme temperatures at that time of the year in late December, and tempestuous winds that resulted in these unprecedented bushfires. How would you like to be in that place with that coming at you? Which is what many people had to face. A wall of fire here is descending on this defenceless town on the east coast of Australia. So they call it now the 2019 and 20 Black Summer. That's the name that they've given to it. They were visible from space. The smoke, the flames and the smoke was visible from space. And the smoke actually reached across to Chile and Argentina. Now this is our picture here. This is a satellite picture. You can see the red dots down there. That's where the fires were down the coast, just south of Brisbane, right down here to Mallacoota in Victoria. And you see this is smoke. Now some of that's cloud down there, but this is actually smoke. And it was affecting people in New Zealand, that smoke. You think about that, the unbelievable effects, the wide-ranging effects of those bushfires. So there was utter devastation in the aftermath. As I said, millions of animals killed, people going back to see their homes like that. Unbelievable consequences for many, many people. Now last year, this article appeared about a book that was forthcoming of the uninhabitable earth, as it was called. And this particular article pointed out that the planet is getting warmer in catastrophic ways, and fear may be the only thing that saves us. They talk about the age of climate panic being here. They quote David Attenborough, who recently said if we don't take action, the collapse of our civilizations and the extinction of much of the natural world is on the horizon. Well, we know. We know, of course, that man is partly responsible for that. We're going to see something else about that as well. Some of you may have heard of the Extinction Rebellion movement. These two pictures actually are taken in Brisbane. That's the Treasury building in Brisbane. So these people, of course, they are revolting against governments. They are saying that the governments are not doing enough. They want governments to tell the truth. And so what they do is they lie down in the streets at peak hour and they glue themselves to the road and they glue themselves to one another. You know, these two people here have got their arms in a pipe and they're glued in the pipe so that they can't be moved. And so they hold up whole cities in rebellion. Well, they're not going to change anything, are they? Because mankind won't move. It'll have to be God that moves them. Now we've got the face of climate change. This, like 16-year-old girl she was at the time, Greta Thunberg. And they're going around the world pleading with politicians to do something. There's no way of escape, they say. No future on Earth, they say, because there is no planet B that they can go to. Now, that's the state of the world that we're living in. So, what about this climate change? Is it man's responsibility or God's responsibility? Well, it's actually both. That's why we read Luke chapter 21. You know, there's passages in the scripture that make it very plain that God does get involved in the affairs of mankind, especially when there's approaching divine judgment hanging over the world. He gets involved to prepare the world for those judgments. One classic case is Ezekiel chapter 14 and verse 13, and this is what it says. Ezekiel 14 and verse 13. I'm not losing Luke 21, I'll be back there in a second. We read Ezekiel 14:21. Ezekiel 14 verse 13. Son of man, when the land sinneth against me by trespassing grievously, then will I stretch out mine hand upon it, and will break the staff of the bread thereof, and will send famine upon it, and will cut off man and beast from it. So God does get involved in bringing judgments in various ways upon mankind before the judgments that he's warned them of. It's a way of indicating that he is in control, not man. Now in Luke 21, this is why I wanted you to be here, in Luke 21 there's a very important verse, verse 11. Now we know that up to verse 24, part A, is all about the period leading up to the judgments of AD 70. Let me just give you a couple of examples. For example, in Luke 21, we read in verse 14 that the disciples that Christ is talking to were told not to prepare themselves when they were dragged before the courts. That's not good advice for latter-day Christadelphians, particularly if you're called up to military service, okay? You need to prepare yourself. They had the Spirit, gifts given to them. They had the Spirit to help them prepare what they were going to... And in fact, they weren't saying anything on their own bat. It was the Spirit that spoke from them. We don't have that today. So that's one indication that this is not about us. Verse 23 is another one. Verse 23 talks about, woe unto them that are with child in those days. No, there will be no problem for Christadelphians with young children when Christ returns to take us to the judgment seat. It won't matter if it's in summer or in winter, but it did matter to them in AD 70. So we know that up to the first half or thereabouts of verse 24, that what we're reading about in this early part of Luke 21 has to do with the events that led up to AD 70. However, that was a pattern. It was laid down as a pattern for the latter days. And so verse 11 says, and great earthquakes shall be in different places. Well, is that not true? In the latter day? Yes, it's true. And famines, is that not true? Yes. And pestilences, what about COVID-19? What would you call that? Okay, so there are all sorts of pestilences and fearful sights, and great signs shall there be from heaven. Now the most important word in that verse is the word from. It's a simple preposition. It's the Greek preposition apo, A-P-O. And it's well rendered. It's a good translation, because this is what the Greeks use in their language for where something comes from. It's a preposition to do with origins. So when it says that these things came from heaven, it means they were divinely guided. There was angelic activity. It was God getting involved in that period from AD 66 to AD 70. He was preparing the world for the judgments to come, and they fell heavily upon his own people in AD 70. In this same chapter, Luke 21, we are very familiar with these words in verse 25. Now we know, of course, from the end of verse 24, we're in our time, because we've got the freeing of Jerusalem in verse 24 from the hands of Gentile control, and then we get to verse 25, which by the way is about 1968. So 68 onwards. There shall be signs in the sun and the moon and the stars, which we know are symbolic for political powers and religious powers and for important people. And upon the earth that is amongst ordinary, the hoi polloi, the ordinary people, distress of nations with perplexity. And we know that that Greek word aporia means to have no way of escape. And the sea and the waves roaring. Now the sea and the waves, of course, is again symbolic language. Sea is symbolic of the nations and the waves thereof, the activity of those nations. And we've seen all around the globe the outburst of all sorts of protests. The streets are full of protesters. The social media is full of protests, isn't it? People are protesting, and the sea and the waves are roaring. Now 2019 saw a dramatic upsurge of street riots in many countries across the globe, mainly for protests against governments who were not treating their people as they should, against climate change inaction, and of course the desire for political freedoms. 2020 burst into flames of protest over black deaths at the hands of police in the United States of America. And you'd have to be on another planet not to know what was going on in America with the Black Lives Matter protests. We had them in the cities of Australia. I mean, there was 30,000 people in Brisbane who protested in the middle of a COVID-19 crisis. We're very fortunate we don't have the situation they got in Victoria right now as a result of that. So protesting has become part and parcel of everyday life. And of course we've seen those protests morph into more than just protests. They became opportunities for looting and for arson and for violence. And that violence, by the way, continues in America. Something like 70 people have been killed since George Floyd died because they're going around shooting each other as a result of that. We've also had another phenomenon in 2019 and 2020 which not everybody's aware of. That's the phenomenon of preppers. You heard of them? These are people who prepare for doomsday. And it's even got to the point now they have television programs comparing preppers against preppers. And they give you a score out of 10 for how good you've prepared yourself for doomsday. That's the world we live in today. They are in readiness for they don't know what. They have no idea what's coming, but they know it's not going to be very nice. And so they're preparing for it. So the world knows that something's coming. Where should Christadelphians stand? We should know a lot more than what they know. And we do know a lot more because we know it and understand Bible prophecy to some degree. So what about these Black Lives Matter protests? Well, since the death of George Floyd, of course, in Minneapolis, at the hands, to be acknowledged, it was terrible what happened. The hands of heavy-handed police. It saw this outburst of protests in America, and then that went all around the world. They quickly became riots with looting and arson in many cities, like places like Los Angeles were on fire. The protests persisted for many weeks with demands for complete change, including the demand for the immediate defunding of the police departments, which, by the way, some cities have agreed to in America. Really? The defunding of police departments. And of course you've seen the images of people pulling down statues of anyone that's even remotely connected with slavery or anything to do with what they call racism. They pull down their statues. And they're putting up in their place in England, for example, a statue of one of the leading protesters in the place of the man who was blamed for slavery. It's unbelievable what's going on. It's insanity, by the way. And the Lord Jesus Christ said in Revelation 16 and verse 14 that it would be insanity that would precede his return to the earth. And we're seeing it from top to bottom. And that's not going to stop. That's going to go on. That will reverberate around the world for a long time to come. 2020 is also the year of pandemics. It began with the COVID-19 pandemic spreading across the globe rapidly. And fearful of a repeat of the 1918 Spanish flu, when they say that 40 million people died in 1918 and 1919. By mid-March, of course, much of the world was in lockdown due to the rapid spread of COVID-19. By mid-year, that is the end of June, over 11 million cases had been recorded around the world and 530,000 deaths. It's a whole lot more just in 2 weeks since that. In some countries, the virus is out of control, like in America, for example, where they had literally scores of thousands of cases each day. And they're nearing 140,000 deaths in America. And Brazil's not that far behind them. So there's a lot of trouble out there. And of course this has meant the shutdown of a lot of industries, including the international travel industry. So travel and commerce and incomes beckon a global depression. That, brothers and sisters, is the best news I've heard in a long time. You know why? Because we will be removed just before that Great Depression hits, and hits this world hard. And the reason I can say that with great confidence is because of Luke chapter 17. So step back to Luke 17 with me. Here was the pattern set in the days of Noah and Lot, and the Lord makes it very plain. Yeah, he could have chosen any era of judgment, couldn't he? He could have chosen the time of the end of Judah, in the days of Zedekiah. He could have even said, well, it's going to be like AD 70. He doesn't say that. He says it was going to be like the days of Noah and Lot. Why does he choose those two eras of time? Well, there are good reasons for it. So let's read Luke 17 and verse 26. And it was, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be also in the days of the Son of Man. They did eat, they drank, they married wives, they were given in marriage. Now in the Greek, I'm not going to go into the details of this, but in the Greek, the grammar has not been properly translated. It's actually talking about some activity going on right now, but it doesn't get to finish. They were eating, and he means restaurant type eating. He doesn't mean eating around your kitchen table. They were drinking. He doesn't mean going to the tap. He means in hotels and clubs. They married wives, and of course the marriage business today is huge because marriages last on the average about 9 or 10 years. So people go into one marriage and out of that into another one and then into another one. And it goes on and on. Until, notice the language of verse 27, until the day that Noah entered into the ark and the flood came. Did you read that carefully? What do you think Noah going into the ark might represent? Before the flood comes. He was in that ark for 7 days before any drops of rain came from heaven. It's telling us something. We're going to be taken, brothers and sisters, to a place of refuge and safety before the disaster hits fully. That's what he's telling us. And the same comes out of the story of Lot. Look at verse 28. Likewise also as it was in the days of Lot. They were eating, they were drinking, they were buying, they were planting, they were selling, they were doing all the things you do in this modern world. Now, okay, yeah, that's one of the things that happened, didn't it? They might have said you can't have ecclesial meetings, but you could still go to Bunnings, all right? You could still go to Bunnings. You could still go and do your house repairs and renovations. That hasn't stopped anybody. So we are waiting for a time when they lift enough restrictions that people get back to doing their eating and drinking, and they've been doing a bit of that, haven't they, in the last couple of weeks? Foolishly in some places. So, we are waiting for that time when the earth goes back to something like the Lord's describing. And as soon as they think that they've got hold of it, we will be whipped away, because the next thing will be the Great Depression that the world knows is coming. They know it's coming. Listen carefully to the comment. They know it's coming. There will be a Great Depression very, very soon in the earth. So here we've got these two generations. They've got these things in common. They were both periods of prosperity. That's why he doesn't choose the end of Judah under Zedekiah. Why? Because they were actually eating each other. All right? He's not talking about times like that. He's not talking about hardship. He's talking about times of relaxation and ease and prosperity. That's when he's going to come to take us to a place of refuge. So we've got these two eras of time. General prosperity in the days of Noah and local, regional prosperity in the days of Lot. You know, it's very fascinating that as you read through this record of Luke 17, the Lord makes no mention of violence or immorality. Why wouldn't you do that when you're talking about the days of Lot and Noah? There's not a word about violence and immorality. Look for it. It's not there. Why? Well, because he wants us to know that the Christadelphians challenge, his disciples' challenge, is not necessarily going to be that. Our challenge is going to be prosperity. The laxity that comes from prosperity. The Laodicean spirit. You know, the easy life spirit. That's the problem that the Lord knew we would have just before he came to take us to the judgment seat. So there's a great warning in that, brothers and sisters. And when he does come to raise the dead and remove us after them, the time of trouble described in Daniel chapter 12 verses 1 and 2 will descend upon this world. A time of trouble such as never was. You think about it for a while. We've got a cashless society now. What about when things fail? What about when banks go broke? What about when they close down the computer systems that run the banks? Think about that for a while. And think about the street violence that will occur when there's nothing on the shelves. You've seen it already. You've seen what happens. So, that's the kind of thing that's going to happen. But they'll get hold of that eventually. It might take them 4 or 5, 6 or 7 years to get hold of that. And when they've just got to the point where they think they're getting back in charge, Gog comes down upon the land. And sudden destruction overtakes them in the events of Armageddon, for which you and I will have been prepared in the presence of our Lord Jesus Christ. That's why the Lord deals with this matter here. And that's why 2020 is very, very important, because they are saying that this disastrous depression is coming and probably will come in the period between September and November. Right? That's when all crashes come. It happened on the 29th of October 1929. Right, it happened in 1987 in October. It happened in 1992 in October. It happened in 2007 in October. So watch out, brothers and sisters. That is where we are heading. Now let's just step away for a minute and just go back into 2019 and take on another aspect of this subject. You know, 2019 was marked by these incredible riots in Hong Kong and the suffering and affliction that's gone on there. You scratch your head and you ask, well, why would that be the case? Well, of course, it's happening at the same time that relationships between the US and China have collapsed. And then, of course, as we got into 2020, what happened? Well, we've got Australia in trouble in its relationships with China. Australia calls upon China to be the subject of an international inquiry because of the existence of the COVID-19 pandemic. And China, of course, pushed back hard, didn't they? Well, why is this happening, do you think? Well, it's happening for a very good reason. Because at the same time, this is the year where by the 31st of December 2020, Britain will be completely out of Europe. They will have cut their ties from Europe. And by the way, they're not going to get their agreement. We'll talk about that in a moment. They won't get the agreement they're looking for with Europe. And Britain's going to be forced to trade with other nations. I wonder who's going to be at the head of the list. You know who is at the head of the list. We'll talk about the young lions in a minute. There are other countries that are in serious trouble as well. Lebanon, Iraq and Iran. They're having huge problems quelling their populations who are crying out for change because there's poverty. People are dying of starvation in those countries. They're without leadership, proper leadership, and they're crying out for that. All of those nations, of course, Lebanon, Iraq and Iran, play an important part in the unfolding of Bible prophecy. I'm not going to have time to talk about any of them, apart from Libya perhaps, today. So what about this aggression of China? Well, China, as the source of the coronavirus, came under pressure, as I said, from other nations for seemingly failing its obligations to the international community. They aggressively pushed back and they threatened strong retaliation against anyone who took up the cudgels against them. So tough new security laws were invented for Hong Kong, which exacerbated international tensions. Britain, Australia and others have offered Hong Kong citizens refuge and political asylum if it gets too rough in Hong Kong. 50 Fearing further economic retaliation from China, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, Australia stepped up its talks with Britain to establish a trade agreement. This is where it's going. This is why problems are occurring in the Pacific, with China putting its nose into all the tiny little Pacific nations, paying off New Guinea's debt, all that sort of... This is why they're there. And the reaction has been to break down the relationship between Australia and China and other nations and China. Australia's trade, of course, depends upon China. And it's breaking down. So where are they going to go? Where are they going to go? Exactly where the Bible says they have to go. And that's what I find wonderful about the events of 2020. You know, Ezekiel 38:13 is pretty clear, isn't it? Sheba and Dedan. Sheba is Yemen. A word about that later. Dedan, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. Okay? And the merchants of Tarshish, Britain, unquestionably Britain, with all the young lions thereof shall say unto thee, art thou come to take a spoil? Now Tarshish can be shown both by scripture, from Ezekiel 27 verse 12, and from history to be Britain. The land, it's called Baratanak in ancient times, the land of tin. And Brother Thomas, in the exposition of Daniel, I'm not going to read all of this, I put it up there to make it very plain, that Brother Thomas pointed out 150 years ago or more, that Britain had no part. He says here in the yellow, it is impossible in the nature of things that Britain can be one of the 10 toes of Europe. They are simply not part of Europe. And so it's highly significant what's now happening. Britain being the land of tin. So here's Ezekiel 27 verse 12. Tarshish was thy merchant by reason of the multitude of all kinds of riches, with silver, iron, tin and lead. They traded in thy fairs. So here is the prophecy against, of course, against Tyre. Tarshish is here identified as a place from which Tyre is identified by historians as the ancient Phoenicians, who were traders, of course, by ship, received various metals. The Penguin Atlas of World History, Volume 1, published in 1974 on page 3, has mapped the trade routes of the ancient Phoenicians and shows that the only place where they obtained tin from was southern Britain. And the Phoenicians called Britain Baratanak, the land of tin. And I've been there. I've been to Cornwall. These are my pictures actually, taken in Cornwall. Tin mines, the residue of tin mines. Cornish gold site, Tolgus tin. Okay? You go to the coast of Cornwall. This was a place called Rosehead. And what you find in Rosehead? You find a Phoenician well. Now the British dug round wells. The Phoenicians had square wells. And here it is. They tell you it's unquestionably a Phoenician well. And there are other indications that the Phoenicians actually had settlements on that southern coast of Britain. Why were they there? All the way from Tyre. They were there to get the metals that Ezekiel 27 says they were coming for. The silver and the tin and the lead. Right, that's why they were there. And so there's no doubt that Tarshish of Ezekiel is in fact Britain. And that's why this prophecy is so important, brothers and sisters. Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of... We haven't emphasised this word enough. The merchants of Tarshish with all the young lions. What does that mean? It means that Britain's going to have strong trading links with its former colonies. And in the last 50 or so years since Britain went into the European Union, there hasn't been much trade between Australia and Britain, or between Australia and New Zealand. They might send a bit of lamb over there, but that's about it. Why? Well, because Britain has been part of Europe, and their trade has to be with Europe. Okay? That's why. But that's going to end at the end of this year. And Australia's trade, New Zealand's trade, with China's going to come to a screeching halt at some point. And that's why, brothers and sisters, the relationship between Britain and its former colonies will be restored. That, to me, is one of the most exciting things that's happened in the first half of 2020. And among the countries, of course, who survived the global financial crisis of 2008 the best, it just happened to be Australia, Canada, India and New Zealand. And all have a British form or system of government. And 3 of those nations actually share the Queen as their titular head of state. So we ask the question, what constitutes a young lion? Well, there's a very important passage in Scripture. It's Genesis chapter 49. It's the very first place in the Bible where a lion is mentioned. You've got to wait till Genesis 49 to read about a lion. And it's in the prophecy of Jacob. In Genesis 49 verses 9 and 10. And this is what you read. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, thou art gone up. He stood down, he couched as a lion, and as an old lion. Who shall rouse him up? The scepter. Now this is the important connection. So you've got Judah being represented by a lion. But then you read this. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet. And of course we know this is a prophecy about our Lord Jesus Christ. For that Shiloh shall come, the Hebrew reads. Yeah, he will come. And of course our Lord Jesus Christ was from the tribe of Judah. He's coming to reign as king over the nations. But what is that telling you about a lion? It's telling you that a lion represents government. It represents rulership. And that's why, brothers and sisters, Brother John Thomas was exactly right when he said in his writings that America does not take any part in latter-day Bible prophecy. You'll find nothing about America in Bible prophecy. He makes that very plain. Jot these references down. If you don't believe me, check it out. Brother Thomas says there is no mention of America in latter-day prophecy. And he's exactly right, because America is not a young lion. America does not have a British form of government. They utterly rejected it in 1781-82 in the War of Independence. And when they put together their constitution, they wanted nothing to do with Britain. They didn't even have titles. You know, they didn't have a title president until 20 years after the War of Independence. Not even George Washington was called a president because they didn't want anything to do with titles. They hated the British. Oh, they might be allies now, but that doesn't make any difference. To be a young lion, you have to have a British form of government. And Brother Thomas could see that. He saw it very plainly. You can have a look at Eureka Volume 3, the Logos edition, page 203. And have a look at the Herald of the Kingdom and Age to Come, 1860, pages 107 and 110. Brother Thomas was asked a question by a sister. What part does America play in Bible prophecy? And he wrote back, 4-page article. And in his first paragraph he says, there are no prophecies concerning America in the latter days, as there are for Britain and for Russia. And he names them off. So let's not get this nonsense about America being a young lion. That's a furphy. It came into our community in 1957, and it came through a brother who was later on disfellowshipped for wrong doctrine. So let's not have that stuff. Let's go to where our pioneers were on these matters. Well then, let's move on from Britain and the young lions and the trading relationship that must exist to the next aspect of things that have happened this year. You know, this prophecy of Daniel 8:25 is very interesting. And through his policy, now we know this talks about the latter-day Gogian dictator in the context. Through his policy also he shall cause craft, Brother Thomas says priestcraft, to prosper in his hand. And he shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace he shall destroy many. There is no greater exponent of the art of destroying people by peace than a man called Vladimir Putin. He is an expert at it. And you know the story of what happened here? There was, of course, a time when the Turks shot down a Russian jet in November 2015 over the border with Syria. And so what we have is, this is July 2019. Now, back in 2015, when the Turks shot down the Russian jet, the Russians closed the borders. They sent very pointed letters. One of them was a demand to return the Hagia Sophia to the Russian Orthodox Church. And they made it clear that they were out of kilter with Turkey. But then all of a sudden, within 12 months, Putin's cuddling up to Erdogan. What's that about? All right, here they are, they're allies now. There's even the Iranian president there in this picture. So what's going on here? Exactly what Daniel 8:25 says. By peace he shall destroy many. And you've probably seen this picture, haven't you? You've got Putin over here, who we believe may well be the Gog. You've got Magog, Germany, all right? You've got Turkey, which are called, the eastern part of Turkey is called Tagama. And you've got France, Goma. Here are four very powerful world leaders, and they're holding hands, all right? It's incredible, isn't it? Ezekiel 38 is bouncing off the page at you. And of course we know that the Russians, many Russians wanted to make Vladimir Putin a Tsar. This is an article that goes back a couple of years now. But there was this huge push to make Putin a Tsar. Proclaim him Tsar, Vladimir. We will do everything possible to make sure Putin stays in power as long as possible, said a politically active businessman, to thunderous applause from hundreds of Russian Orthodox and members of the country's top political parties. They want the return of the monarchy for Russia. Well, he's got it, hasn't he? He's got it. He's effectively got it. Brother Thomas said in Elpis Israel, page 432, at some time hereafter, and that not far off, a Tsar of Russia will be both Emperor of Germany and autocrat of all the Russias. Yeah, you understand Bible prophecy, you can be living in 1848 and get it right. That's the important thing. You understand Bible prophecy, it doesn't matter what era of time you can get it right. He's glued to the throne, this article said, this year, January 2020. How he's preparing to rule forever. Well, he won't rule forever, of course. He'll be bumped off in due time. In his State of the Union speech in January this year, he announced a complete overhaul of the Russian constitution. The Prime Minister, Dmitry Medvedev, resigned along with the whole cabinet. Putin, of course, is 66 years old. He's pretty healthy. He's the wealthiest man in the world, perhaps bar one. He's certainly the most powerful man in the world. He fits all the requirements of Gog, brothers and sisters, and he can now rule until 2036. 2030, that's 16 years away. In March, Russian President Vladimir Putin submitted to Parliament a number of constitutional changes, including amendments that mention God and stipulate that marriage is a union of a man and a woman. No LGBT in Russia. It's out. Putin doesn't want that sort of stuff. Why? Well, he sees himself as the defender of the faith. He's the man behind, and the church is behind him. He's behind the church, and the church is behind him. The current leader of the Russian Orthodox Church is a man called Kirill. And when he came to power, you know what he said? He said, I'm going to make the Russian Orthodox Church a Putin church. And that's what it's become. On the 1st of July, his amendments were approved by a manipulated referendum, and they're all manipulated political votes in Russia. But it's ironical, isn't it, brothers and sisters, that Russia has made itself the defender of elements of biblical principles, while the rest of the first world pursues a raft of humanistic liberties that defy and utterly reject divine principles. Isn't that curious? That the possible Gog could be leading the charge against humanism? Really? That's very important. You know why it's important? Armageddon is a religious conflict. It's not just a political war. It's a religious conflict. That's made very clear in Bible prophecy. And here's this man who can rule to 2036. He displays all the characteristics that are outlined in Ezekiel 38 and Habakkuk chapter 2. In fact, Habakkuk 2 tells you how he came to power in 2000. So he may well prove to be the Gog in time. The Russian Orthodox Church fully backs him. It's pushed for him to be made Tsar Vladimir. In June, Russian Orthodox Patriarch Kirill consecrated a cathedral dedicated to the armed forces, built to mark Victory Day in the celebration of the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II in Europe. So here you've got a church that's actually glorifying war in a cathedral. That tells you something. Armageddon's going to be a religious contest. Yeah, and God will get involved in it. Now, moving on from that particular, we'd like to spend more time on that, but we can't. I want to move on now to the powers mentioned in Ezekiel 38 verses 5 to 7. We can't say too much about Persia. That includes Iran. It's a much bigger territory than that. Ethiopia, of course, is actually about Sudan. It's the nation south of Egypt. And Libya. We want to say a little bit about Libya. right, because Libya is coming to the news of late in 2020. We know who these powers are. The Galatians or Gauls, this is the Gomer of Ezekiel 38, who migrated to France. They represent the nations of Western Europe today. The countries north of Israel, due north of Israel, that is eastern Turkey or Kurdistan, and Armenia. Armenia is the Tagama of Ezekiel 38 and verse 6. And of course we know that Gog is there as a guard over them all. So what about Russia, Turkey, Syria and Libya? Well, all of that cuddling up to Turkey a year or so ago, it's now gone. Russia and Turkey are now on different sides in two Middle East wars. On the 24th of November, as I said, in 2015, the Turks shot down a Russian jet bomber over the Syrian border, which led, of course, to problems. And finish the sentence. When Turkey turned to the US, Putin repaired the relationship, even supplying the S-400 missile system. The fact that they did that was designed to get rid of America's influence in Turkey, because you see, Turkey was also going to take the S-35 jet fighter that the Americans are producing. And the Americans said, no, if you've got a Russian missile system like the S-400, you can't have our jet fighter. That would completely undermine our security. And Turkey said, go jump in the lake. And so the relationship between Turkey and America broke down as well. In late 2019, Turkey reacted to Putin's broken promises on Syria, and a war beckons between Russia and Turkey over that last little enclave in Syria. Now, let's turn to Libya. This is the other conflict where Russia and Turkey are at loggerheads. The first civil war in Libya, of course, was in 2011, led to the demise of the dictator. The second civil war began in 2014 and is still ongoing. Russia supports a man called Haftar, Khalifa Haftar. He's the strong man who resides over here on the border with Egypt. This is his stronghold here. See this pinkish colour? That's the territory controlled by his people. They call themselves the House of Representatives. Over here in the green, the western part of Libya is under the control of the internationally recognised Government of National Accord, or GNA. And its militias, of course, forming the Libya Shield Force. Now these two are in conflict. Haftar tried to take Tripoli about 2 months ago, and he's been driven back. And when he was driven back, the Russians supplied jet fighters. Of course, they repainted them, so they didn't look like Russian jet fighters, but they supplied Haftar with jet fighters to try and get his own back on his enemies in the west. So what we've got here, of course, is a mess. Turkey is on one side, supporting the internationally recognised government, and Russia is on the other side because they know that Haftar will eventually win. And when they do, he's going to have an enormous debt to the Russian nation. That's why Ezekiel 38 puts Libya in the Russian camp. It's happening right now. It's exciting, isn't it? 2020, it's happening right now. Now, what about in Israel? The West Bank. Now, you will be aware of the prophecy of Ezekiel 38, verse 8. It says that when Gog comes down upon the land of Israel, he comes down upon the mountains of Israel. Have a look at any map. The mountains of Israel are from Hebron, down here, to Mount Gilboa, up here. 90% of the mountains of Israel are in what's called today the West Bank. So what is that prophecy telling us? It's telling us that it will not be Palestinian territory. There will not be a Palestinian state in the West Bank. It will be Israeli territory. And when they went to the last election in Israel, third in a row, by the way, both the major parties, the blue and white, and Netanyahu's party, both those major parties had the same policy. And the policy was that which was decided by the Likud party on the 31st of December 2017 at 11:45 p.m, 15 minutes before the new year. The Likud party voted to begin the process of annexing the West Bank. Now, Netanyahu wasn't really keen on the idea, by the way. He wasn't even at the meeting. He wasn't keen on the idea, but he's keen on it now. And on July the 1st, they were supposed to do that. They were supposed to annex it, but they didn't. Why didn't they? Why didn't Israel move on the 1st of July this year? Well, because you see, they weren't going to get the original deal of the century. Donald Trump's deal of the century. It had been changed on them. So what was the original deal of the century? Well, it was this. Plan B is essentially as follows. The state of Palestine would be established in the Gaza Strip, plus large tracts of territory to be annexed from northern Sinai. Egypt has agreed to this outline. This was a DEBCA report of the 16th of December 2017. Now, why is that important? And why is it important that Israel do take control of the West Bank? Well, because prophecy has to be fulfilled. And if there is to be a Palestinian state, where is it likely to be? See those two references there? Joel 3 verse 4. Let's have a look at these two. Joel 3 verse 4. You know that Joel 3 is all about Armageddon. Don't need to go into the context. It's full of Armageddon. So Joel chapter 3 is about Armageddon. And when I can find Joel 3, I'll read it out to you. Here we go. Joel chapter 3 and verse 4. Yea, and what have ye to do with me, O Tyre and Sidon? Now the preceding three verses are about Gog coming down upon the land, all right, all nations being gathered in the valley of Jehoshaphat. It's Armageddon. What have you got to do with me, O Tyre and Sidon, says Yahweh, and all the coasts of Palestine? Now, I ask you one question. Does the West Bank have a coastline? Answer, no. The closest that the green line of the West Bank gets to the Mediterranean Sea is 9 miles, whatever that is in kilometres. All right, that's the closest it gets. The West Bank does not have a coastline, but this Palestine does. It has a coastline. Now, Zephaniah tells you the same thing. Zephaniah chapter 2. Now, people say, oh, but you're just quoting these verses out of context. Read the context. We're not out of context. Have a look, for example, in Zephaniah 2 verse 11. What do you reckon this context is? Yahweh will be terrible unto them, for he will famish the gods of the earth. What does that mean? Well, all the gods of the earth are starved out of existence. That's what it means. And then it says this, every one, and men shall worship him, every one from his place, even all the isles of the nations. So what do you reckon that's about? That's the kingdom of God. And that comes on the back of Armageddon. Okay? So we know what the context is. Just step back a little bit. Come back to verses 4 and 5. For Gaza shall be forsaken, and Ashkelon a desolation, and they shall drive out Ashdod at the noonday, and Ekron shall be rooted up. Woe unto the inhabitants of the sea coast, the nation of the Kerethites. Kerethites were Philistines. And then it goes on to say, the word of Yahweh is against you, O Canaan, and it should read this way, of the land of the Philistines. We get Palestine from Philistines. So this is another place called Palestine. It's got a coastline. Okay? It's telling you something, brothers and sisters. It's telling us that Israel has to have control of the West Bank. Ezekiel 38 verse 8 and verse 12 tell us that. Talks about being in the navel, the midst of the land. Look at any map of Israel. The midst of the land is where the mountains of Israel are. That's now the West Bank. It's going to be in the possession of Israel. And sometime this year, they will take it. Because both parties, and they're of course in coalition at the moment, an uneasy coalition by the way, but they both agree that Israel will take control, if not of all the West Bank, certainly part of it, and ultimately of course they'll take all of it. That's why they're determined to annex parts of the West Bank, as article after article is telling us. Well, I've said all that. We're getting towards the end, I think. Got another bit of patience here? All right. We're getting towards the end. One of the most important events that happened this year was the assassination of this man, General Qasem Soleimani. You've heard about him? He was, they call him, they said this is cutting off the head of the octopus, right? This man's tentacles were in every single nation on earth supporting any rebellion against existing governments, especially the governments allied with America. and Israel. He was in control of the a special part of the armed forces of Iran. And his role was to make sure that money and expertise went to the Hezbollah in Lebanon, to the Houthi in Yemen, to the militias in Syria, and to any other nation on earth where there was some kind of revolt against US or Israel, any Western interests. He was the man. He was irreplaceable. And the Americans got him. They got him on the 3rd of January this year. And that has changed the entire landscape of the Middle East, brothers and sisters. Now it's very different. This is why you've got the things going on in Lebanon. This is why there are people protesting in the streets of Iran, because they are being denied the basic elements of everyday life while money was going into all of these adventures elsewhere. But now, of course, because of US sanctions, Iran is bankrupt. They're finished. They can't put that money out there, and they haven't got the man who was doing it either. It's changed the landscape of the Middle East, and it's going to produce its results in due time. Peace for Israel is coming. The death of Soleimani was an enormous bonus for Israel towards peace. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthi in Yemen, Assad's Syrian militias and other the Hamas in Gaza have had much of their financial and logistical support taken away from them. Saudi Arabia, Oman and other Gulf states, apart from Qatar, who's hanging back, are seeking closer ties with Israel because of Iran. They're fearful of Iran, and they are remarkably quiet about what's going on with the West Bank. They don't want to damage their relationship with Israel. It's become too much of a benefit to them. And the US is putting pressure on the Gulf states to make peace with Israel. So there's a lot of power going in to pushing those nations who have been Israel's enemies for 7 or 8 decades to make them realise the value of having peace with Israel. Why is that important? Well, because Ezekiel 38 says that Israel has to be at peace internally and with its neighbours at the time of Armageddon, and we are actually watching it happen. So a quick review. What does Ezekiel 38 require? It requires a dictator to dominate the entire Eurasian continent to the north of Israel. We think we might have him. It requires the territory east and north of Israel to be under Gogian control. It's slowly being drawn under Gogian control. Syria. Russia, by the way, controls now the oil wealth of Iran. Russia has also got both an air base and 2 ports on the Persian Gulf, all as a result of their fiddling in that country. It requires a dependent Europe falling under Gog's political control. The President of France has now said, the time has come for us to reconcile ourselves with Russia. Right? Moves are being made in that direction. As we've said, the West Bank must be part of Israel proper, verse 8 of Ezekiel 38. That Israel be at peace internally and with its near neighbours, verses 8 to 11. That Israel be very prosperous and envied, which is true today, by the way. That Yemen, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states will be the first cab off the rank to oppose the Gogian invasion. Not Tarshish and the Young Lions, by the way. It'll be Yemen and the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia, the first ones to object. And Britain and the Young Lions will follow suit. Okay? Brothers and sisters, we know we're at the end. We know we're very near the end. You know, it's possible, isn't it, to lose a bit of patience. Why does it go on? It just keeps going on. The advice of Habakkuk is very relevant. Wait for it, because it will surely come. It will not tarry.